Go.
Test. Test 1, test 2, test 3, test.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me through the mask? Yes, great. My name is Melissa Holm Johansson, and I'm very happy to see you here tonight. Thanks for braving this great Minnesota weather. I wanted to talk a little bit about Sara Aimée Smiseth, and then we'll get the show on the road. Sara is from Haugerud I Groruddalen in Oslo. In addition to performing in Norway with her very unique program of musical and verbal storytelling, she has also given solo appearances in Canada, Sweden, and here in the US before. In fact, we met in 2018 when she gave a similar lecture performance of the music of Edvard Grieg. And I knew that there was something very special about her right away, so I wanted to grab her and bring her back. So I know firsthand that she has a real gift for the storytelling, and as you will see, and you're in for a special treat. You can find more information about Sara on her website, www.sarasmiseth.com, and also refer to tonight's program. If you like what you're about to hear, which I know you will, she has her brand new released CD for sale in the back. It just was released yesterday, I believe, so I'm not even sure any copies have been sold yet, so that's exciting. They are going to be for sale for $15 in the back, and she's available to sign those as well, I believe. Come back and hear more tomorrow. She will be featured for the 11 a.m. church service tomorrow, and she's also at 2 o'clock tomorrow leading a piano masterclass for some younger students around the Minnesota area. We're going to have a brief reception after tonight's performance, and we are going to keep it in this church. We're not going to brave it over to Norway House. So please join us down below in the fellowship hall after tonight's performance. There is no intermission for tonight, and I believe we will wrap up in about 70 minutes or so. This concert is being live streamed on the Facebook YouTube channel, and it's going to be archived. So after this performance, please spread the word and let people know that they can still catch this performance and hear it. Please take a moment to silence your phones, if you have not, and take a glance at the program. Sit back and enjoy this beautiful, beautiful evening of music by Agathe Backer Grøndahl. And please help me welcome Sara Smiseth.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Melissa. It's so nice to be back here. I actually played here in Mindekirken at Tuesday Open House 4 years ago. So thank you so much to the Edvard Grieg Society of Minnesota, and also to Mindekirken and Norway House for having me. But when Melissa and Edvard Grieg Society was kind enough to reach out to me, I just assumed that they were interested in a program by Edvard Grieg. But I'm so happy that they were excited about presenting a program with music by Edvard Grieg's close friend, and frankly one of the most famous Norwegians of her time, Agathe Backer Grøndahl. But just first, let me get one thing straight. You're perfectly normal if you haven't heard her name before. Just wanted to make sure no one is feeling left out or anything. I mean, she was one of the most public figures in 19th century Norway and Scandinavia. But Norwegians today usually barely know her name. But I'm on a mission to change that. Yes, thank you. So in the music history that I was taught as a student, Agathe Backer Grøndahl was this famous pianist who wrote a few songs for voice and for piano. And I always thought that there had to be more to her than just that. So much more that I decided to make a whole concert about her. But when I sat down to research what I was going to present and my storytelling, I was actually quite disappointed. Because in all the music history books that I could find, it didn't really say anything more than I already knew, that she was this pianist who wrote a few songs and so piano music. But then I came across Camilla Hambro's doctoral thesis about Agathe Backer Grøndahl from 2009, where she has gives this incredibly well-documented full picture of who this woman really was. So based on that research, here is the story of an artist, the story of Agathe Backer Grøndahl. Thank you. So that story starts in Norway, or more specifically in the city of Holmestrand, a small town really by the Oslo fjord, about an hour south of Oslo. And Agathe Backer's parents, Nils and Sofie Backer, they were both from fairly wealthy merchant families. And they had 4 daughters, all who would do music or art at a very high level. In fact, 2 of them, Harriet and Agathe, would become among the greatest artists in their generation in Norway. Harriet as a painter and Agathe as a musician. So what was it with this family, with all these talented children? Their father, Nils especially, was very interested in art and music, and he would improvise, or he would tell fairy tales to his daughters and improvise kind of the soundtrack on the piano for them. And in this environment of musicality and creativity, Agathe composed her very first piano piece at the age of 5. And when she was 9, the whole family moved to Oslo, to the capital. And back then, in around 1850, Oslo had a population of a whole 30,000 people. It's a big city. And Agathe, because of her talent, she got the most famous Norwegian composer at the time as a teacher. His name was Halvdan Kjærulf. And then she had her confirmation in church, and she finished her schooling, and she was at a crossroads. And when her mother started talking about marriage, she wrote to her cousin, "She can talk all she wants," because at this point she had other plans. So we're now in the 1860s, and back then there was no conservatory in Norway. You had to go abroad to study music, and Agathe's teacher, Kjærulf, he wanted her to develop her talent. He wanted her to travel abroad to study, but he also knew that making it a career as a woman could be a challenge. And just like her parents, because we know this from letters, he and her parents basically advised her to keep it as a hobby. Like Kjærulf said, an ornament to light up the world of those around you. But the 17-year-old Agathe wrote to her teacher, "I feel there is something within me that will never give me peace and which constantly drives me onward. For I love music so much that my desire to master it or to excel in it is undescribable." And 17 years old, she moves to Berlin. And she had 3 years at the famous Theodor Kullak's Academy for Music. And she graduated as one of the top students of her class, both as a pianist and a composer. And at her final exam, she performed one of her own works for piano and orchestra, a scherzo, with herself as a soloist in front of a full symphony orchestra on a big stage in Berlin. And then she went back home to Norway to establish herself at home as well. And in her very first public concert in Oslo, she was a soloist in Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. And she was 21, and the conductor was a friend she had met a couple of years earlier. That was her friend, the 25-year-old Edvard Grieg. And Edvard and Agathe, they stayed friends for the rest of their lives. They sent each other their music, they advised each other, and they became of great personal support when it was needed. But it wasn't just Herr Grieg, it wasn't just Mr. Grieg. It was also, the thing was that when Agathe performed or premiered her very first official opus, that was a set of songs. She played the piano part, but the singer who premiered the voice part, that was, of course, Nina Grieg, the wife of Edvard Grieg. And these 3, Edvard, Nina, and Agathe, they were in their 20s, hoping to make a career of their music. And Agathe chose to follow her heart and not the advice of her teacher or her parents. And she was well on her way to actually make a living of her music. And now she also met another musical acquaintance that would actually invite her to go here to America. That new musical acquaintance was the famous violinist Ole Bull. Now let's just take a second to introduce him. He was the Norwegian Paganini, this famous, handsome virtuoso who traveled the world and climbed to the top of the highest pyramid in Egypt and performed there. People would buy his bathtub water and wear it as perfume. Yeah. And he would actually start his own colony of Norwegians here in Pennsylvania in the US, which lasted for a little less than a year, but that's not the point. And coincidentally, my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side, he was so lucky as to hear Ole Bull perform live, and he wrote down the account of it. And my great-great-grandfather, Ernst Sisler, he came to Oslo as a theology student in 1851. And at the university matriculation dinner, Ole Bull was a guest of honor. And he wrote the following. And then the great artist entered. I have never seen such a perfect, handsome man in my life. And he improvised so delightfully on his violin that 100 arms lifted it up and carried him around the room triumphantly. And I was so excited, he wrote, that as the maestro was carried past where I was standing, I couldn't help myself. I just had to reach out and pinch Ole Bull's thigh. Yes, you heard correctly. My grandfather's grandfather pinched Ole Bull. I'm quite proud of that. Yes, thank you. But yeah, let's get back to our main story here. Because Ole Bull was in Oslo at this point to promote his new invention, a brand new type of grand piano that he claimed never needed tuning. And he chose the young and talented Agathe Backer to accompany him on this piano. And it was such a great success that he now wanted Miss Backer to travel with him to the US to promote this piano here. And she thought about it, but she declined respectfully. And Ole Bull, although he held himself in very high regard, he was a polite and gracious man, so no hard feelings about this. And in fact, we know that a couple of days later, he saw Agathe Backer in front of a jewelry shop, admiring this pendant necklace. And he bought that necklace and sent it to her, and he was so generous as to have the pendant inset with a picture of himself. Yes. So Agathe Backer didn't go to America with Ole Bull, but she went on another journey. And before she left Norway to travel around Europe, she wrote letters to the influential people she now knew in Germany, Denmark, and Norway to get their references to introduce herself to other influential musical acquaintances. Networking is not a new invention. And she traveled with her sister, Harriet, the painter. And it was actually just the two of them traveling. They were in their early 20s, and Europe at this time was kind of unstable, several wars going on. Sadly, that sounds very familiar today. But they went, just the two of them, and Harriet said that they were never really afraid. But Agathe had, just in case, just to be sure, she had purchased a so-called blackjack. And if you don't know what that is, it's just, a practical, small, portable bludgeoning device that she would always keep in the pockets of her skirts, just to be safe. But they traveled down to Italy, to Rome, and they traveled to Florence, where Agathe was a student of the famous Hans von Bülow for 4 months. And they traveled up to Germany, to Weimar, because now Miss Backer was going to have a go at meeting Franz Liszt. And I think we can all agree on that Franz Liszt maybe still is, and at least was probably the world's most famous pianist. And the city was full of young and hopeful pianists who wanted to meet the great composer and the great performer. And Agathe, with her letters and references, they got her right through, and she met him personally, played him some of her own music. And to this day, in the Franz Liszt archives in Hungary, you can still find music by Agathe Backer. And she was accepted to become a part of his court of pianists, so to speak. So that summer, she was a part of that very exclusive group that would have lessons with Franz Liszt at his house 3 days a week. And every Sunday, Liszt would perform to them. And when the summer was over, Harriet and Agathe went back home to Norway. And with that, Agathe had finished her education, and now she knew that it was up to her to find her own path forward. A few years earlier, Agathe Backer had met the singer and the choir conductor Olaus Andreas Grøndahl. Everyone close to him just called him Olam, so I'll do that too. And after a 5-year-long engagement, they got married. And at the time, it was kind of common for women musicians that once they were married, they stopped performing in public. But this didn't even seem like an option to them, maybe because she married another musician, but also maybe because she was so well established at this point, career-wise. So they were both 27 years old, and they now moved in together in an apartment in Oslo. And immediately they started taking in students in their home, Olam singing students and Agathe piano students. And with Olam's choral conducting, with Agathe's concerts and composing, they managed to contribute pretty equally to the household economics. Actually, Agathe probably earned more than her husband a lot of the time. But it didn't take long before Agathe Backer Grøndahl became pregnant. And in the fall, October 1876, she gave birth to a daughter, Ingeborg Sofia. But unfortunately, she didn't survive, and they lost their baby girl after just 2 months. And 2 weeks after they had lost their only daughter, Agathe's beloved father passed away. And what was her reaction? Well, she threw herself into work. But about a year after that, she gave birth to a son, Nils. He was healthy. But in between all the pregnancies and everything else, she had long periods of illnesses, and one illness that actually caused her to almost completely lose her hearing on her right ear. But despite all of this pregnancies, with all that entailed in the 19th century, losing a child and losing some of her hearing, this didn't stop her from pursuing her career. And Mrs. Grøndahl, she gave birth to 4 children over a period of 8 years, and 3 sons grew up. And we know that they had a housekeeper, a wet nurse, and a cook. And in the middle of bringing up children and everything else, one day she got a job offer from Baltimore here in the US, because the Peabody Conservatory of Music wanted her to be their primary piano professor. And she hesitated, so they offered her husband a position as well. Again, she ended up declining another offer to go here to the US. And from I've read, musical life in Baltimore at the time probably wasn't that much more developed than it was in Oslo. But at least in Oslo, she knew what she would get. But so she was actually able to have her career and have her or raise children as well. But as a pianist, she became quite famous for her performances of works by Beethoven and Schumann and Chopin, but more and more she would perform her own compositions. And it was also a great kind of promotion for selling her sheet music, and she sold lots and lots of music in those days. And one of her most popular encores was a piece called The Dance of the Fuldra. And Fuldra in Norwegian folklore is this female character, kind of disguised as a beautiful woman usually, but the only way you could tell that she is a Fuldra is that she has a tail. And this character is in lots of Norwegian fairy tales. And with this dance of the Fuldra, not only is it folk music, which was very high fashion at the time, it was also female folk music. And I think we can all agree on that being a woman in the 19th century wasn't always easy, but here in the dance of the Fuldra, I think she uses it to her advantage. The year 1889 was going to be a great year for Mrs. Grøndahl. Finally, her 3 sons had become a little bit older, so it was easier for her to travel abroad. And it has been my impression that it was the summer wind and maybe some of her male colleagues that got her to England. But in fact, it was all her own initiative. Her own initiative, yeah. She wrote first a letter to her friend Nina Grieg, and then she wrote to Edvard Grieg. And she apologized about 100 times in these letters, but she asked, when it came down to it, if Grieg could make use of her, as she said, on his upcoming trip to London. And Grieg said, yes, of course. So for the first time in her life, she was going to England, traveling to England. And for the first time in her life, she was going to be a soloist in Edvard Grieg's A minor piano concerto. And the highly critical London audience couldn't stop applauding. In fact, Mr. Grieg and Mrs. Grøndahl had to go back out on the stage 5 times. And the critics gave him rave reviews, and writer George Bernard Shaw proclaimed that Mrs. Grøndahl was one of the greatest pianists of the century. And she would return to England later, but now, this time, she continued straight to Paris and the World Fair in Paris in 1889. You know, the one where the Eiffel Tower was built. And again, she was a soloist in Grieg's A minor concerto, and one of the biggest newspapers in Paris wrote, "Technically exceptional, musically outstanding, she is a queen at her piano." Can we just take a moment to remind ourselves of my image of her from the music history books, as one of those women composers who wrote a few songs and so piano music? Why did I not mention her 2 works for orchestra, her cantata, her choral works, her concert etudes, her piano suites? And why did I not mention that she, a Norwegian, was a soloist on some of the world's largest stages for classical music? She was a student of Franz Liszt, for crying out loud. Why did I not say this? And I can't understand, I don't know why. And I'm also struggling a little bit about this need to always put her in the category of women composers or female composers. I never hear any talk of male composers. And I suggest that we rather look at people, who they were, what they wrote, what kind of music they liked, what they accomplished with their lives. But I think there's no doubt that in her own time and age, she had to really balance on a knife edge to be able to do what she did. Because we know, on the one hand, from her letters, that she was actually quite conscious about what she wore on stage. Nothing too revealing and nothing too colorful. But we also know that some of the critics who reviewed her concerts, I mean, some of them were seemingly almost infatuated by her. I mean, some of the critiques, some of the reviews, it's almost embarrassing to read. They were very positive. And then on the one hand, in interviews, she would always emphasize on the fact that she was a mother and how she liked staying at home. But also on the other side, or on the other hand, she was frequently a soloist in grand piano concertos with all-male large symphony orchestras. But I think she was highly intelligent, and I think she understood her time and the social roles of her time, because she was really dependent on staying within the boundaries for what was accepted behavior for women at the time, in order for her to execute her profession and her art. And that's why I think, in some cases, she herself built that image that we so often see women composers as. That image of someone where she emphasizes on being a mother and a person of the sort of homely sphere. But the problem, I think, is that the music, or the writers of music history after her, they haven't gone and had a closer look and seen her for what and who she really was. Because in my mind, there's no doubt whatsoever that she was of great importance as a pianist and a composer, both in Norway and abroad. Agathe and Olam now moved out to a house on an island in the Oslo fjord. Today that house is not very far from the city center, but in the 1890s it was a bit of more of a tiresome commute. And actually the cover of my album, my CD, that's a photo I taken from the view from that house at Ormøya. But I mean, everyday life continued out there. She was able to continue as a composer, she was teaching, and she was touring, and she also had an endless row of concerts in Oslo, both as an accompanist and a pianist. And she organized all of her tours and concert series herself. And interestingly, I think, because she was a mother, she was more in Norway than a lot of her male colleagues. And that meant that she would tour extensively around Norway. And I think that actually made her have a closer relationship with the Norwegian audience and Norwegian people than a lot of her male colleagues who spent more time abroad. But speaking of Norway and Norwegian music, I think Norwegian classical music, that is practically synonymous with Edvard Grieg. He is by far my country's most famous composer. And his use of folk music became, or Norwegian folk music especially, became important as Norway was struggling for independence from our union with Sweden. And in many ways, Edvard Grieg is the sound of Norway, our independence and our culture. Also in many cases, you can almost get the impression that Edvard Grieg invented Norwegian folk music, but that's not true, of course. He came along after, or the music existed long before he came along. But the first Norwegian composer to extensively use Norwegian folk music in classical music was actually Agathe's first teacher, Agathe, or Halvdan Kjærulf. And I've heard several people say that Agathe Backer Grøndahl wasn't that interested in folk music, that she was more oriented towards European music. But that is a rumor I can disprove. And again, because she was so much traveling in Norway with her family, her youngest son Fridtjof said that every time they went somewhere with their family, his mother would always meet with the local folk musicians and the local fiddle players, and she would write down and collect folk tunes from wherever they went in Norway. And where Edvard Grieg only on one known occasion actually wrote down a folk tune himself, Agathe Backer Grøndahl did it as often as she could. And I think it's something with hearing the music in the surroundings where it came from, by the fjords or the forests or the mountains. I think that made her had a greater familiarity with the material. And she ended up arranging more than 50 folk tunes for both voice and piano. And I think one of my favorites is a tune called The Maidens of the Shivla Valley. And there's a story behind that tune. Because it was long time ago when Norway was going from the old Norse gods and over to Christianity. And in the Shivla Valley in Telemark, there were these two maidens who were the last two heathen girls of Telemark. And one Sunday morning, during church mass, these two girls were sitting up in a mountainside, playing so beautifully on the ram's horn that the congregation inside the church started listening to their music instead of the priest. And it ended up with a whole congregation going outside to listen to this magical sound of trills and melodies wafting across the valley. And the priest argued and tried to get them back in, but they wouldn't listen. And it ended with that the priest, he became angry and raised his voice and condemned the two girls. And immediately the music silenced and the two girls were turned into stone. And according to legend, you can still see those two columns of stone in the Shivla Valley in Telemark to this day. The year Mrs. Grøndahl turned 50, she still had an enormous workload. In addition to raising a family, she spent hours and hours composing, teaching, touring, and all these concerts in Oslo as well. But at one point, she started having trouble sleeping, and she experienced even further impaired hearing, and also she had a stronger and stronger tinnitus. And she reached a point where she just had to stop working, and eventually she was submitted to a treatment center in Sweden for people suffering from so-called nervous exhaustion. And both physical and mental illness had taken Mrs. Grøndahl from big crowds and big stages and successes to sitting alone a long way from home in a place that was frankly a psychiatric institution. And I'm not sure she thought she would ever be able to perform again. But one day when she was there, she received a letter from her old friend Edvard Grieg. And he wanted her to be the soloist in his A minor piano concerto in Bergen that spring. And the doctor is positive, so she says yes, but immediately regrets it and sends another letter, like an hour later, where she writes that Grieg must know that she has had a break of almost 5 years. She almost hasn't played in 5 years. And he must know that she's not where she used to be. But Edvard Grieg writes to his old friend that he thinks that her illness in this case is called a lack of confidence. And he writes that she should tell herself, I want to play because that is the medicine that I need. And he says, I believe in you and you will succeed. And Agathe Backer Grøndahl travels to Bergen, and she's as nervous as ever, but she plays, as Grieg says, as beautiful as she has ever played before. And the audience is completely beside themselves. And for the first time in her life, she now hires a manager who says, no more concert until you've had your comeback in Oslo. And the tickets for that concert were sold out in just hours, and she entered the stage 51 years old with the royal family present, and the hall was so full that people were standing along the walls. And even before she had played a single note, the audience wouldn't stop cheering. And she embarked upon new tours in all of Norway and Scandinavia, and now exclusively with her own music, her own compositions on the repertoire, because that was exactly what the people wanted. They couldn't get enough of Agathe Backer Grøndahl. But then illness struck again, and her hearing became just worse and worse, and her right ear, which had been considered to be almost completely deaf for 26 years, that was now her best ear. And first it became impossible to play concerts, and then it became impossible to have students. And what she was left with was this really strong tinnitus. And also, as she put it herself, all this music that played in her head, whether she wanted to or not. But in January 1907, Edvard Grieg visited Olam and Agathe in the house out on the island. And neither Grieg nor Mrs. Grøndahl would survive that year. And at this point, Mrs. Grøndahl could only communicate by pen and paper. And she wrote to Grieg next to her that it had been a long time since she'd been this much conversed. And Grieg said later, or wrote later, that it was very difficult for him to see her this kind of fragile and downhearted. And for him, the saddest thing was that when Mrs. Grøndahl's youngest son, Fridtjof, had his big official concert debut as a pianist, his mother, Agathe Backer Grøndahl, was there only because of her hearing as a viewer and couldn't actually hear her son play. And we think she got tuberculosis, but no one knows for sure. But on June 4th, 1907, Olam sent a telegram to Trollhaugen in Bergen to Edvard and Nina, saying that Agathe had passed away that afternoon. And she had her closest family present, and all the newspapers were full of obituaries the days after she had passed away. But one article that everyone was waiting for never came, because Edvard Grieg was simply too devastated to be able to write anything. But he wrote this in his diary. I received a telegram where it said Agathe passed at 4 in the afternoon. If Agathe was just like a mimosa, which is a delicate flower. And if a mimosa could sing, sound and music would stream forth from it, as from Agathe's most beautiful, most intimate melodies. Olam had 16 years as a widower, and unlike his wife, he got to see their 3 sons married, and he also spent a lot of time with their, in time, 9 grandchildren. And the oldest one, Nils, he became a doctor and the director of the largest hospital in Bergen, and he was also very fond of the outdoors, and he became the president of the Norwegian Mountain Climbers Association. And Anders, number 2, Anders, Agathe always appreciated how he lit up her world with his joyful spirit, as she said. But she was very skeptical about him becoming a businessman and not an artist. But he ended up starting Grøndahl's piano service, so that company actually still exists today. He was able to combine music and business, and they are still tuning pianos around Oslo to this day. And their youngest son, Fridtjof, who had his concert debut while his mother was still alive. He had a long career both as a pianist and a composer. And Grieg, Edvard Grieg, rarely took students, but he promised to take Fridtjof under his wings after Agathe passed away. But Grieg outlived Agathe with only 3 months. And but Fridtjof still continued his mother friendship with Nina Grieg for as long as she lived. At the same time as the Norwegian struggle for independence from our union with Sweden, there was another important movement in Norway. And Agathe Backer Grøndahl was a member of the Female Voting Rights Association, together with many of her female colleagues and her sister Harriet. And the summer of 1902, hundreds of women from all the Nordic countries were gathered in Oslo for a big conference about women's rights. And they witnessed the premiere of a brand new cantata by Agathe Backer Grøndahl. The libretto, or the text, was written by a friend of her, which was one of the most important Norwegian suffragette women. And it was a full female choir, soloists, and the composer herself as accompanist and conductor. And I think maybe, because one thing was to be a female or a woman and be a composer and a pianist. Another thing was to be a woman and have anything to do with political issues. But I suspect that maybe in her later years she was able to move maybe the boundaries a little further of her room for maneuver, something like that. But Agathe Backer Grøndahl, she was one of the most public figures in Scandinavia for decades. She was an important composer. She was an ambassador for Norwegian folk music. Her last composition, one of her songs, was translated to English and premiered in Royal Albert Hall in London to commemorate her. And her more than 70 opuses, consisting of 400 single works for orchestra and piano and choir and voice, I think that makes her kind of deserve to be up there with Edvard Grieg and his peers. Here ends this story of an artist, this story of Agathe Backer Grøndahl. But I hope this inspires you to keep looking or digging in history for anyone that interests you. And I would be so bold as to say that it's never too late to rewrite history. Thank you so much for coming out and listening.